This is Alejandro Freire speaking. I'm one of the global directors and community and academy manager for the international coaching community. Many thanks for being connected today with this special webinar with Otto Laske, who's founder and director of Interdevelopmental Institute, and who's working and offering the opportunity to ICC to explore things and topics related to developmental coaching. Otto has made a deep and profound work on developmental coaching based on the developmental sciences. And yesterday we started a course about exactly that, developmental coaching, and how the coaches can get the distinctions for that. So this is a course we started yesterday, and today we are complementing that course with a brief overview of how developmental coaching can impact the team coaching work. So I'm sure you will enjoy this new set of dimensions and distinctions that Otto has to share. And thanks again for being with us today. So I'm going to welcome Otto now, so we can start. Many thanks, Otto, for being with us today. Then.
Yes, thank you, Alejandro. I want to say hello to all of you. It's a great pleasure for me to speak with you. So as Alejandro just said, developmental coaching can be applied to individuals and to teams. And of course, the more one knows about developmental coaching of individuals, the better one is going to be in developmental team coaching. I will show you the intersection between individual and team coaching today in this webinar. Now, here you can see what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to introduce a new team coaching paradigm. I'm talking about a work level approach to team coaching, where by work levels I mean what level of accountability is a particular team and its members on? And you will understand later why that's important. I will also introduce diagnostic tools that I call social emotional and cognitive tools for intervention, for intervening, working with teams. And I will finally then talk about a typology of teams that is based on the methodology I adhere to, called the Constructive Developmental Framework. And if I have time, I will also go to some main issues in team coaching. So much of this will be new to you, and I would encourage you to ask questions, and I hope to chat with you at the end of this hour, so I won't really want to talk more than 45 minutes. There is a business case to be made for developmental team coaching if you consider how many interventions with teams are not effective. And the question is why? Team coaching has a huge literature, all of which is focused on how team members behave in a team. That is actually not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about their maturity. So I'm introducing here the term of team maturity. And maturity is a developmental term. 10 years ago, you were less mature than you are now. And in 50 years, you will be even more mature. So we are speaking about lifespan development from birth to death. My experience over these 15 years of teaching developmental coaching has been that to bring about effects in teams that are lasting, to have developmental tools as I introduce you to here today is very, very helpful. But I want to reassure you that the tools you know already for team coaching, you don't have to throw out. Rather, I want to increase or enlarge your toolkit so that you can work with teams both behaviorally and developmentally. As you know, you can see here on this slide, the majority of team coaches today is looking at team development in 4 dimensions or so. Team coaches try to clarify teams' performance goals, problem-solving skills, role definitions, meaning helping team members better understand what their function is in the team, and maybe even in the organization. And then also relations between teams, within and between teams. Considering that most of the work in organizations is now done by teams, team coaching is more and more important. Now, as I said, in conventional team coaching that you know and probably practice, there is a gap. There is something that has to be added, namely a focus on adult developmental maturity of team members. And a team is only as mature as its members are. So in this webinar, I want to talk about 2 questions. What is team maturity? And how can a coach who has studied adult development address team performance questions by using his or her insight into what I call the developmental profile of a team or of team members? And you will understand that better as we go. Let me first define team. Not every group is a team, as you know. But if we have a team before us, we can say it's composed of people at different developmental levels. So one person in the team will be somewhat immature, another person will be more mature, in a sense I will explain to you. And so we can say that typically members of a team are within a particular developmental range. And what that is, I will also explain to you. So the first important idea here is that a team is mixed of levels of different developmental levels. If you work with a team for an hour, you can pick out the people who are less mature than others, as you will probably have done. The other aspect on teams which is important here is to distinguish between the interpersonal process of a team, which has to do with how they work together, how they relate to each other or don't relate to each other, how they communicate and so forth. And on the other hand, their task process. And by task process, I mean their focus on the goal, their way of thinking about the decisions they are making. So the interpersonal process is quite different from the task process. And still, the 2 processes go together in a team. But for a coach, it's important to know what problems in a team right now, at this moment, are interpersonal process problems and what are task problems. For instance, a task process problem is the team is not sure what its goal is. They don't have a consensus on the goal. And that is a cognitive issue. That has to do with how they think about the goal, how they think about themselves in the team, how they think about the team in the organization, how they think about the goals the team has set itself. I call that cognitive. The other interpersonal process has to do with human relations, and I call that social emotional. It's emotional, but it's also social, so I call it social emotional. And you will find throughout this webinar and throughout my course on team coaching and individual coaching that these 2 aspects are always separated by me in order to be linked, not to be kept separate, but to be linked. In other words, in order to understand an individual or a team, you need to understand both sides of the person or the team, namely the social emotional level of maturity and the cognitive level of maturity. And that, I'm sure, will be new to you. And here you're making a small beginning to start thinking about that. The best teams are teams, in my experience, in which the interpersonal process and the task process are truly balanced. Or I should perhaps say, the best teams are those in which the interpersonal process, the way they relate to each other, does not hinder or hamper or obstruct the task process. Because many teams come to nothing, not because they don't think well and don't understand their goals well, but because they can't get along with each other, or they don't know how to relate to each other. So the two really need to be seen together. Now, in what I'm saying here, I would say I'm shifting paradigm. I'm going from the currently dominant paradigm to an emerging and new paradigm. The dominant paradigm is to focus on competencies of team members, on their personal traits, to look for smart performance objectives, to focus on activities, to matching a person or the team to a task. And so in this perspective, what I call human capital is really considered a standalone dimension. It's the HR department. It's a standalone dimension in the sense that it has no input at the strategy table where the decisions are really made. And so as long as team coaching is focused on competencies, traits, tasks, activities, it's not going to go very far because it doesn't have a global impact on the organization as a whole. So in order to do team coaching in the emphatic sense, you need to understand the function of the team in the organization and its relationship to other teams in the organization, and the interplay between the teams in the organization, and maybe even in another organization. And so that's what I call the emerging paradigm, and I will simply spell it out here, although it will not make much sense to you yet, but maybe more sense at the end of the hour. I'm going to focus on capability, which is not behavior. Capability is not competence, but is the way you make sense of the world and the way you make meaning of the world. And it has to do with the two dimensions I have already distinguished between social emotional, namely social emotional and cognitive. So there are two aspects to capability: social emotional capability and cognitive capability. And all, as I say here, have to do with how you, in your mind, create reality. What is real for you? How the world shows up for you. Now that's a crucial question in teams as well as in individual coaching, because a team of 10 people, there are 10 different world views in that team, because every person has his or her own world view, which has to do not only with their psychology, but with their life history, their focus in their work, and, as I say, their maturity. Team coaching also, secondly, needs to pay attention on what I call the value add. If you think of team members in a team not being all on the same level of accountability or responsibility, let's say there are 3 levels in a team. The leader is at the highest level. Then there are some people who work directly with him or her, and below that maybe a 3rd level. But even if there are only 2 levels, the upper level, the higher level, adds value to what all the team members do, and that's what I mean by value add. So the team leader adds value to the work of the team by being the team leader, by guiding the team. That's an added value that the team members do not bring to the work. Another focus in team coaching is what I call role-role relationships, by which I mean this. People in the team are not just people, personalities. They also work on a particular level of responsibility, which I call a role. So if your role is to be, a sales manager, that's different from the role of being a salesperson. These are different roles, and I will go more into that. I think we can leave it at that now. And so here I've been talking about developmental coaching shifting to a different paradigm from the dominant paradigm. And so in a way you can look at these two paradigms depicted here by saying that the left paradigm is behavioral, focused on behavior, and the right paradigm on the right side is focused on development. Now, here we come to a very important distinction between behavior or learning and development. Learning lies on a horizontal axis where it is a matter of mastering competencies, skills, ability, but that's not development. Development has to do with orders of consciousness. It has to do with how you see the world, how the world shows up for you. And when you are 20, the world shows up for you very differently than when you are 30, right? And when you are 40, very different. And if you are 70, the world will show up for you totally differently, okay? So that's what I mean by levels of development, about which I will talk more. But it's important for you that you begin to distinguish between learning and development. And I put learning with behavior because learning in itself is not development. You can learn all your life and develop very little. There are people who are very learned, but they are not developed. They are immature. Up to a point, of course. Now, the important thing here in this distinction, which I show in a different form here, is this. Learning and behavior take place along this horizontal line, and development takes place on the vertical line. So when I say behavior, I mean the horizontal line. When I say development, I mean the vertical line. And on the vertical line, the two aspects of development are, again, as I said before, the social-emotional development of a person and team member, and the cognitive development. Now, it's important to understand also that the English term development has two very different meanings, the second of which you probably don't know. Because in English, we say things like, we develop this team. So then development is seen as an activity that we do to, let's say, develop a team. That has to do with agency. We are agents of development of others. Like you as a coach, you develop others. Of course, in doing so, you develop yourself as well. Now, the agentic meaning of development is not what I'm dealing with here. I'm dealing with what I call the ontic meaning, which is something that goes on by itself. If you, whatever you do with an individual in coaching or with a team is very different from the development that takes place in the team without you, without any intervention of agents. And that is called adult development. And so here again I show the two dimensions. And I won't go too much further into this. I think you got the main point here, that we need to distinguish between the vertical development and the horizontal behavior and learning, and that when it comes to the vertical, we are looking at the social emotional and the cognitive development, which I will go into now. So let's make a kind of summary now. I'm calling this the capability pyramid. And I mean that there are different levels. So coaching typically has been looking at the upper level here of usable competencies, skills, experience, and so forth. That's behavioral coaching. There is a middle level, which I will come to after I talk about the lower level. Developmental coaching takes place at this lower level, where we address the hidden potential of team members or individuals. That's what I have called capability. As you see here, there is social, emotional, and cognitive capability. And this diagram is saying the following. And I will be quite black and white here to get my point home, driven home. To focus on behavior up here makes no sense if you don't look at this capability, because the developmental level will determine what can be learned and what competences can be effectively used. If you are at a high level, excuse me, if you are at a high level of development and your personality is suited to the work that you do, then you will be able to use your competencies in full. So here I'm making a distinction between having competencies and being able to use them fully. And I'm saying that you can have two people who have the same competencies, one of whom is mature and the other is immature. So guess who is using his competences to the fullest? Not the immature person. So for instance, you can be an accountant, or you can be whatever you want to be, a manager in a company. You can have all the competencies the job requires. But if you are not a good thinker and thus are not cognitively developed, and you have an image of yourself which is other dependent, as I will introduce in a few minutes, then although you have the competences, you cannot fully use them. Now, companies are not interested in competences they have, although as long as they work on competence models, they seem to be. What the organizations are really interested in is how fully you can use your competencies, and that's a developmental issue. So the notion here is that you have a certain capability or maturity, and depending on your ego and subjective needs and beliefs and defenses, you will be able to use your competences, so that, the psychological domain here in the middle is a kind of filter that will determine how able you are to use your competencies in full. And of course, in both individual coaching and team coaching, what we want individuals and team members to do is to use their competencies in full. But in order to enable them to do that, we need to look at their capability or level of maturity. And that's really a new paradigm. I think you will agree. So in terms of a summary, we can say then that there are three dimensions in team coaching, and I speak here, for the moment we can forget about what I call size of person here. So we have a cognitive dimension, we have a social emotional dimension, and we have a behavioral dimension. And the arrow shows that the cognitive dimension will determine the social emotional, and both together will determine the behavioral dimension. That means, in a way, what I'm saying is, your behavior is determined by how mature you are. Now, let me try to give an example. Let's say right now you don't get along with a colleague of yours, or your client doesn't get along with a colleague of yours. And if you think about that developmentally, you're not thinking about psychology. You're not even thinking about behavior in the first place. You are thinking about what is this person's world view or frame of reference that makes him have this conflict. How are the two parties related developmentally? Is one more developed than the other? Are they both equally developed? In what way? That's the developmental mindset. So in the course that will follow this webinar at some point in the fall or early next year, the focus will be on the two lower levels here, on the cognitive and the social emotional. Now let me get to what that means. Organizations are complex. Even family business has different levels of accountability. One person has to be the boss in some sense. And so these different levels of accountability are different levels of thinking and decision making. And each of them is kind of a world to itself, which I want to make clear now. This work level approach I'm introducing here to teams requires us to look at two sizes, the size of person and the size of role. Now, in terms of your coaching, each client of yours has a particular size of person because he or she is at a particular level of development. But if this person works in a company and you do executive coaching and not life coaching, this person is also in a particular role. He is either a clerk or a manager or a supervisor or a CEO or a board member. That's a role. And we have to separate the two. Why? Because the crucial question is this. Is a particular person in a particular role sufficiently mature to be in that role, to be effective in that role? If not, the person is in the wrong place. And we can coach him however much we want, he will not become fully effective in his role. So it makes no sense, for me at least, to coach a person without paying attention to the role he or she is in, and to have the person understand the role. Because in an executive context, we are never only coaching a person, we are coaching a person in a role. And a role we can distinguish between different roles by distinguishing between different work levels. And I will give you an example on the next slide. Here I am making a distinction between 7 different levels. And each of the levels has to do with size of role. And as you see, on each level, a different focal point or focus of the work is in question. At the lower level 1, your client will be concerned about quality and service delivery. How well do I deliver the services I'm hired to deliver? What is the quality of the service? That all takes place within the present, or not more than 6 months. I mean, the time horizon, if you can say that, of your client will be very short. In other words, your client will not have to think 5 years ahead to do well what he does. It will be enough to think just 6 months ahead. That's one work level. The next work level is one in which the person in the role has to have a broader vision. He must be thinking about, how am I going to do this work in a year from now? And so as we go up, the clients, whether individual or in teams that you are dealing with, will have a longer and longer time horizon. The people at the board member, they will have to look 20 years ahead. You can't coach a team that is meant to look 20 years ahead like you coach a team that has a time horizon of 6 months, right? Now, if you never make these distinctions, you don't really know whom you are coaching. You may know the person, but you don't know the person in the role. And it will also be clear to you that a person or a team of people at this level 1, and maybe mixing level 1 and 2, will have a very different, what I call, universe of discourse, what they talk about, what concerns them, than people at level 6 and 7, right? And so it's a very important distinction to make in developmental coaching that has to do with the size of the role of team members. Now, I've spoken of 2 aspects of capability and maturity, the social emotional and the cognitive. So let me say a little bit in terms of an overview about the social emotional. We measure social emotional development in terms of stages. Here what you see is the lifespan development of a person from birth, although stage 1 is not shown here, to old age. And I'm distinguishing 4 stages, 2, 3, 4, and 5, which I call instrumental, other-dependent, self-authoring, and self-aware. You also see that there is this ellipsis going back and forth, this curve that goes from focus on self to focus on others. That has a very good reason, because development, social emotional development, has to do with how much you're focused on yourself and how much you're focused on others. And you can see that the social emotional development goes back and forth between these 2 foci, right? So at level 2, which we all have been at as a teenager, we were very much focused on ourselves, and it needed a long time for us to get socialized so that we could finally become able to imagine how other people feel and think that are different from us. And finally, we learned to be a member of a group in a way that the group was essential to us, because without being a member of the group, we could not have defined ourselves. And actually, most people remain at this stage, social emotionally. And so all of your clients, whether they're individual or teams, are here in this area between stage 3 and 4, because some of those clients I would call self-authoring, in the sense that they don't define themselves by others' expectations, but by their own value system. So it's an arduous journey to go from stage 2 to stage 4, which can take 10 years of your life. And most people never go further than this, but some go beyond. I will not go into details about that. I just, here in this webinar, I just want to give you a kind of a feeling for what adult development is. Because at each of these stages, at each point on this curve, the world that you see is different from the point that you have left behind. And it's also different from a point that you may get to later in your life. That's social emotional development. Now, why would this be important for teams? Well, clearly, depending on where on this curve you are as a member of the team, that will determine how you play in the interpersonal process of the team, right? What I've called the interpersonal process. And then let me go a little further now into the cognitive aspect, the cognitive level of maturity. Actually, I'm distinguishing teams in terms of what I call stratum, which is another term for level. And I don't have to go into great detail here, but I want to point out again, as I did before when we talked about this slide, about size of role, that, wait a minute, let's go forward, that if you become the coach of a team, I think it behooves you to know, or to get to know, what kind of a team are you actually dealing with? Are you dealing with a team at stratum or level 1, which we have already talked about, having to do with service delivery and quality, with a 6-month time horizon? Or are you talking about a level 3, level 4, level 5 team, which is focused on, at level 3, rethinking operational processes in the organization, or creating a breakthrough in the market, or devising new business models? So you have to understand from what your team is about, what your team is working on, what level the team is. And you have to coach accordingly, because you cannot coach a level 2 team like you coach a level 4 team. And so that's part of the course on developmental team coaching. One overriding characteristics in terms of cognitive capability that you can see here in the outer column is this, that the lower the team level, the more they are focused on the present. And as you go from the present to the future, the higher the team level becomes. Because people on the board of directors or in the CEO team, executive team, they have to look into the future. They are not concerned with the present. They are asking, how can we maintain ourselves over the next 5 years or 10 years, and maybe only 2 years, because everything changes so fast today. So that's a cognitive issue in team coaching, the time horizon of a team, and the focus of the universe of discourse. I don't think I have time to go into this, but I want to say that we can actually measure or determine informally the level of thinking in a team by using what I call the 4 moments of dialectic. And briefly, what this is about is fluidity of thinking. If you are thinking only in context terms, as I call it here, the world that shows up for you is a static world. And you never get into the dynamics of the world and the relationships in the world, and that cuts down on your fluidity of thinking. So the cognitive team issues are these. People do not grasp the complexity of issues. They misjudge what are the next steps to take. They have no big picture of the potential outcome of the decisions they are making. And they have failed to develop a long-term view of their own participation in the team. And that's where you come in, the team coach. But you, in your mind, as a team coach, you have to be very clear about, is this a cognitive problem or is it a social emotional problem? And what is the relationship between the two? Because in your team coaching, there may be a point where you ask yourself, do I need to do cognitive coaching now, or do I need to do social emotional coaching? Or in more concrete terms, you will ask yourself, do I need to attend to the team's interpersonal process now, or the task process? Now we can speak of, okay, so let me summarize. I have introduced you to a new paradigm of team coaching, the focus of which is on capability and maturity, which has two aspects, social, emotional, and cognitive. I have distinguished between learning as horizontal and development as vertical. I have distinguished between interpersonal process, which is social emotional, and task process, which is cognitive. Not to separate these things, but to link them. But you can only link what you have separated before. So now, how can we get a bigger grip on teams in terms of what types of teams are there? Now look at these two teams. They have different levels of maturity. You can see that right away. Even if these are, people in their 20s, they are not an executive team. Their operations are more routine than complex. And so here we have levels of maturity that are very evident. Now let me go back. I want you to go back to this slide here where I distinguish between stages 2, 3, 4, and 5. And briefly summarizing this, I would say the following. A person at stage 2 has an adolescent mindset, where I, as an adolescent, I'm in the center of the world, and I'm using you to get my needs fulfilled. Even if I love you, as I love my mother, essentially it's all about me. I come first. But then in social emotional development, we learn to be part of a group, but that means we define ourselves by the expectations of the group. So we don't have a value system of our own, even if we think we do. It's only when we get to level 4 that we have our own value system, which we may have to suffer for, because people may not like our values, they may kick us out of the group, and we have to stand to our values despite suffering for them. I don't need to go to 5 here. So now if we apply that to teams, we get a typology which I show here. There is no team at which all members are at the same level of development, in my experience. So we can say that all teams are developmentally mixed. There are people in the team that are at a lower level and a higher level. So if we apply this perspective to teams generally, then we can have a team that comprises people that are mixed from level 2 and 3. So we have a self-centered focus clashing with an other-dependent focus. That's a level 2-3 team. We can have another totally different team in which members are at level 3 and 4. Then the two foci that are clashing are other-dependent and self-authoring. Let's say you have a team of 7, okay? 3 are at level 3 and are other-dependent, and thus are defining themselves by the expectations of others. And 4 are self-authoring. I call that a downwardly divided team because at the lower level, downward, we have people who don't have their own value system, and they will likely follow those people who have one. And so the level 4 people will probably run the show in the team, but the other people at a lower level, they will hinder them from doing their work optimally. So these people can turn into obstacles of reaching team goals, not so much because they behave this or that way, but because they are less developed. They are less mature. They don't think as well. They don't position themselves to others interpersonally, optimally, so as to achieve the goals of the team. And a third overall team could be one in which we find members of level 4 and level 5. And, I think I will not go into that because all I wanted to give here is a kind of overview that you get the notion that you are dealing in most cases with developmentally mixed teams, and you have to figure out who is the more developed person in the team and who are the less developed people in the team. And how do I work with both, and how do I help those less developed to work better with those that are higher developed, more highly developed. I could go into more details about this, but I won't. I would just want to, at the end, let me see. Yeah, I want just to summarize some of the central issues in teams. There are social emotional issues on the left, and there are cognitive issues on the right. The most important social emotional issue I have encountered in working with teams is the question, how detached can I, the team member, be from important others in the team? That's a social emotional issue. What do I mean? I mean the question of to what extent can I or do I rely on my own value system? Can I live with making decisions that turn out to be wrong or have turned out to be wrong? And having to justify them. So this has all to do with social emotional maturity, size of person, capability, maturity level. Because at level 3, at which you find 60% of all people in the world, those people don't have their own value system. They go with what they hear from their neighbors and their other team members. They don't stand up to them. That's the social emotional issue. The biggest cognitive issues are here. What is missing in my understanding of the big picture of things that we work on in this team? Can I think about beyond myself? Can I think beyond the team? Can I see the team functioning as a member of the organization? Can I think of other teams that we are in relationship or competition with? That's what I mean by big picture. How big is my picture of what I'm doing as member of a team? There are other questions that are cognitive, like, do I see the world changing? Do I see underlying processes, let's say in the goals we have set, that they seem to change from week to week? Do I understand this movement? Or do I understand the relationship that defines situations that I encounter? And can I see these situations in transformation, meaning always changing? All of these are developmental questions in team coaching. So let me try to give an example. We have a team of 7, 3 at a lower level, 4 at a higher level. These 3 people at the lower developmental level actually have more power than the people at the higher level. So they don't go with the better thinking people, but they put up resistances. They make conflicts happen on account of their power. Now, how do you deal with that? You'll have to deal with it. You cannot deal with it behaviorally. You need to know more about the developmental level of these people if you want to help them. There would be a lot more to say, but I think I don't want to overload you. There will always be the question for you once you have learned developmental team coaching. At this point in the team this morning, do I coach cognitively or do I coach social emotionally, and when do I shift from one to the other? And for both of these kinds of coaching, the methodology I will teach you will give you tools to work with. These are not just ideas, these are tools. Because cognitive team coaching deals with moments of dialectic and thought forms, and social emotional coaching deals with levels and interventions at particular levels. And all of that has to do with how you communicate with a team and how you listen to the team. And listening will be more than just active listening. It will have to be deep developmental listening, because you will have to decode what people say as to what is the level from which they are speaking. So this, and then something about yourself. My experience over the 15 years I've taught this to an international body of students is that students develop as individuals as they absorb developmental knowledge and use it in individual coaching or in team coaching. Because you probably will agree that coaches are effective not on account of their skills. You can always learn new skills. There's no end to that. Or methodologies or models. Coaches are effective on account of how developed they are themselves as adults, developmentally thus. So the level of development can be quite accurately assessed by the methodology I'm using. But that's not the point here. The point is that learning about team coaching is a way of developing yourself, not only to become more effective, but to become a more developed adult. I think I would like to leave it at that for today. And so I'm hoping that there will be some questions, either about the course to come, or what I will teach in it, or what I have said today. So you're all welcome to come forward with questions. I would love to hear some of your questions and comments.
Many thanks, Otto. Then we can open for a few questions using the chat box, whereby you can write a question there, and we can read a few and address a few. Otherwise, you can raise your hand and we can open the microphone for you if you want to talk directly with Otto. So I give a few minutes on that, and then we see.
For instance, you might want to think about how does what you do in team coaching now relate to what I've told you about interpersonal process and task process and levels of responsibility and behavior versus development. Such questions will come up for you, won't they?
Yes, indeed. Indeed, Otto. Okay. Otto, we have a question from Helen.
Yes.
Asking, do you tell the team about these aspects openly?
That is a good question, thank you. No, I don't. I do not, in the sense that they are part of my perspective, and I have to reframe my developmental understanding into questions and comments that the team can understand. So, for instance, if I feel that one of the team members is very immature in the sense of always following other people's values and not having any of his or her own, but at the same time trying to obstruct the team process without really standing up for his own values, then I would address that person and ask him or her, I have been wondering what are the values or the value you are following right now in this discussion. What is really important for you at this point in the working of the team? And so I would try to elicit comments from the person which I can developmentally decode. That means I can interpret them developmentally. And that I would feed back to them, to the person or to the team as a whole. So, for instance, I could say, it seems to me that the team discussion we have been in is focused on two very different sets of values. One value having to do with getting this project approved and carried out as soon as possible and as expertly as possible, and the other one to really do more work on, are the goals we are following here the right goals? And will these goals be still relevant in 6 months from now? And so as a coach, I would try to clarify, and this would be part of the task process, not the interpersonal process, how do these values to relate to each other, and in what direction does the team want to go? Is it a matter of finishing the work quickly, or is it, more of an issue of doing really good work? So the developmental coach will always have to translate behavioral issues that people understand into developmental ones and vice versa. And that's what learning developmental coaching, I would say, is all about. So your question is a very good one.
Many thanks, Otto. Here we got a few more. The next one is from Sarah. What would be the recommendations to scale through the cognitive stages?
Can you repeat that, please?
Yes, what would be the recommendations to scale through the cognitive stages?
When you speak of scaling, do you mean to bring people to a higher level of cognitive fluidity?
As I understand, yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, here we are talking about cognitive coaching, and I haven't given you the tools to really understand how that works. I have only mentioned to you two things, what I call the moments of dialectic and the thought forms, dialectical thought forms. So let me give you an example of a thought form. A thought form is a way that structures our thinking or the thinking of our clients. And so if a client, and I find it easier at this point to give an example from individual coaching, but it carries over into team coaching. So let's say your client tells you his present or her present work situation and describes it in totally static terms, as if there was never any change on the horizon. And in cognitive terms, That's a very restricted way of thinking, because the person is not thinking of the future, of what has been changing, of what could change. And so the fluidity of thinking of this person is low. And you, as a developmental coach, whether in teams or with individuals, you have the task to make people aware of the structure of their thinking, of what they are not thinking but could be thinking. So you have to master the thought forms and become a model for thinking more fluidly that you can demonstrate to them. That would be my short answer.
Many thanks, Otto. We have several questions pointing to the same aspect. The summary of that question is, do you do individual assessments with every member of a team prior to the intervention phase?
That's another great question. I do individual assessments of a team when I'm asked to put a team together. When I'm not given that option and I have to coach a team, or I decide to coach a team that is already constituted, I make the proposal to do an assessment, but I cannot always do it. Often there is no time to do it, or people don't understand what an assessment would yield. And so the answer is yes and no. I do it wherever I can, because I will be much more effective having made an assessment. But I cannot always do so. However, if you learn to make formal assessments, which, by the way, is not part of the team coaching course, but is taught separately, then you begin to be able, through your practice, to make informal assessments where you can, with some clarity, say, this team breaks down into 4 other dependent and 2 self-authoring people. But it takes learning the assessment first and then practicing them. So, it's not immediate.
Many thanks, Otto. And we have a final question, if you agree, from Sarah.
Yeah.
That she's saying, if I'm a coach and I relate with about 60% of people who's more social, emotionally developed, what would be the recommendation for me as a coach to upgrade my development? Is it possible?
So you're saying I am socially more on the same level as about 60% of the team, but the 40% of people in the team are more highly developed. Is that the question?
Actually, yes. Sarah is saying yes.
Okay. So, as I would say in individual coaching, if your client is more developed than you shouldn't be coaching them, because you will not only be not effective except behaviorally, but not developmentally effective. You could actually do harm because you don't understand the more developed worldview. So I would recommend, and this hasn't sunk in the conventional coaching world, that the coach always has to be more developed than the clients, whether it's an individual or a team. Now, you are asking, how can I become more developed? Well, I think, life is the best course you can take to become more developed. But in your work, you are also becoming more developed because, as we say here, coaching is interdevelopmental. That means through my developing others, I develop myself. And there is no shortcut to development because it takes years. It doesn't take a week or month. It's not a matter of learning. You can't learn to be more developed. You can't acquire skills to be more developed. Development is more subtle and is longitudinal, is across time. So I have no real answer to the question, how can I become more developed, unless we go into more depth about how does this development work and what does it look like. But I'm sure you can become more developed through your work as a coach. And maybe that's the reason why you are in this kind of work, because I have encountered many people who say I became a coach to develop myself. And that's good because coaches need to be higher developed than their clients, and that's what they want to do. I'm not sure I have answered your question well, and if not, can you let me know?
Yes, Sarah says very accurate. Thank you very much for your answers. So it's addressed. So Otto, many thanks for today's webinar. It was very enriching. I think it's opened a new perspective towards the development of teams and for us as coaches. So thanks again for giving your presence for this. And for everyone, we are going to share the recording afterwards and provide you with more information about the ongoing courses and the upcoming ones. So if you are interested, you can join, of course. So.
Yeah, thank you. It was a pleasure speaking with you. I hope to hear you again.
Thank you. Take care. Until the next session then. Bye-bye.